Welcome to Single Serving Excel. Today we're going to work on formatting a pivot table. We're going to use the pivot table that we created from the video Excel Pivot Table Overview. If you haven't seen that, the link to it will be in the description below, as well as a link to the data source so you can work alongside this video. Let's take a look at the pivot table. We are summarizing total fans by country by all styles. Let's add another row to this data by dragging band name to the row section just below origin. If you're missing your field list, just click anywhere on the pivot table and it will show up. So let's bring band name down to the rows section just below origin. Now the pivot table is summarizing total fans by country, by band, by all styles. This is Excel's default layout of a pivot table. From my experience as an analyst for many years, management finds this view messy and they prefer the classic pivot table layout. So from here on out, you'll see every pivot table in the classic layout. Let's change this pivot table to the classic layout right now. First, you'll want to right-click anywhere on the pivot table. Scroll down to Pivot Table Options, go to Display, and check the box Classic Pivot Table Layout enables dragging of fields in the grid. And as my personal preference, I also like to uncheck Show Expand Collapse buttons. Click OK. And now you're in the classic pivot table layout. Let's filter the entire pivot table by the style alternative. That way we can see the entire pivot table as we edit the formatting. Excel makes formatting a pivot table quick and easy. All you need to do is click a cell on the pivot table to make the Pivot Table Contextual tab appear, and then click its Design tab to display the command buttons. The Design tab on the Pivot Table Contextual tab is divided into three groups. The first group is Layout. This adds subtotal and grand totals to the pivot table and modifies some basic layout options. The next group is Pivot Table Style Options. This group refines the pivot table style you selected from the Styles gallery. The final group is Pivot Table Styles. This group contains a gallery of styles you can apply to the active pivot table. Let's start by selecting a style from the Pivot Table Styles gallery on the Design tab. Click on the down arrow and you'll see all the styles that are available to you. Notice as you roll over each style, the pivot table dynamically changes its formatting. It won't keep a formatting until you actually click on a style. Let's pick something that's not too obnoxious. Let's click on Light Green Pivot Style Light 21. As a side note, don't pick something overly colorful. If your boss prints out in a black and white printer, it will look terrible. If they print it in color, you'll probably get yelled at for wasting color toner. The Layout group on the Design tab contains the following four command buttons: Subtotals, Grand Totals, Report Layout, and Blank Rows. Subtotal is used to hide or display the subtotals or have them displayed at the top or bottom of the reports. Let's get rid of the subtotals for now. Click on the little down arrow below the Subtotals command button and select Do Not Show Subtotals. Actually, on second thought, let's put them back on. So let's repeat those steps, but this time click on Show All Subtotals at the bottom of group. Grand totals is used to hide or display grand totals in the last row or column of the report. Since we only have one value field in the pivot, there isn't a grand total for columns. What we do have is a grand total for all the rows, and that total is 1.6 million for all fans in the alternative style. If we want to get rid of this grand total, click on the little arrow next to the grand totals command button and do Off for rows and columns, and the grand totals is gone. So let's put it back on. Repeat those steps, but this time click On for rows and columns. Report Layout modifies the display of the report by switching between compact form or more spread out outline form. It also handles how you display the repetition of row data. Notice the row data for the field origin. It only lists each country once with a space in between each one. If you wanted this row label to repeat, click on Report Layout and then click on Repeat All Item Labels. And now the origin country repeats. If you want to undo that, click on Report Layout again and this time click Do Not Repeat Item Labels. Blank rows inserts or removes a blank row after each item on the table. Notice how above each country there's a blank row. If you want to make the pivot table look more compact, let's remove those. Click on blank rows and then remove blank line after each item. Let's keep it this way. I think it looks a lot better. The Pivot Table Style Options group contains the following 4 checkboxes: row headers, column headers, banded rows, banded columns. Row headers removes or adds the font and color formatting from the row headers of the table. Notice as I check and uncheck row headers what happens to the pivot table. The countries go from bold to unbold. Column headers removes or adds the font and color formatting from the column headers at the top of the table. Notice what happens when I check and uncheck that. Column headers loses its light green color and the fonts go from bold to unbold. Banded rows removes or adds banding as grid lines or shading from the rows of the pivot table. As I check and uncheck banded rows, the pivot table alternates shading for every other row. Banded columns removes or adds grid lines or shading from the columns of the pivot table. As I check and uncheck that, only one column is being shaded and unshaded. Let's leave everything as the default with row headers checked, column headers checked, banded rows unchecked, and banded columns unchecked. You may find yourself wanting to apply formatting that's beyond what the pivot table styles did. For example, you may want the subtotal to have a different size font and shading. You can make these types of formatting changes by selecting the part of the pivot table that you want formatted and then click on the appropriate command button. So let's say we want to make the subtotals a different shade of green and be a different size font. You want to roll the mouse over the subtotal and make sure that the cursor turns to a right arrow like this. And now all the subtotals are highlighted. Right click on the pivot table and let's change the shading to be a different shade of green, and let's change the font size to be something larger. Notice you can just scroll over each font size and the pivot table dynamically changes without actually committing the change. Once you find something that you like, click on it and the pivot table changes. Now what I've seen in the past when people are formatting pivot tables is they'll individually select each item and then apply the formatting. You never want to do that because it won't apply the changes to the entire pivot table. So make sure that the cursor changes to that little right arrow and that when you click on it once, all those items in the pivot table are highlighted. Since this pivot table is from a previous tutorial, the format of the numbers already changed with a comma in the thousands place. Whenever you first create a pivot table, Excel does not format the field that you put into the value section of the pivot table. Typically, the numbers have no decimals and no commas. But if you want to change the format of a field in the value section, go to that field in the value section, click on the down arrow, click on Value Field Settings, click on Number Format within the Value Field Settings dialog box, and then select the appropriate format that you want. In this case, we already picked number, use thousand separator, and no decimal places, and we clicked OK. But since it's already done, I'm just going to click Cancel. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave a comment in the section below. Also, like and subscribe and click the bell icon for updates on new videos.